too many voices now, and it's too much bias, and there's never gonna be agreement again. Universal classics, like you think if Drake Iceman come out and it's something that I feel is a classic, do you think that this that don't like Drake and been spending his whole time on him is gonna agree to his platform that it's a classic?
Yeah. Lobbies and gentlegrams, the traffic of albums packed with fantastic tracks that lasted the passage of time, whether massive platinum hits or spastic spits of bombastic bars, was in abundance. Musicians made magic moments with classic components of their catalog, but currently the climate has seen a fog, a drastic tragic lack of massive classic albums we've seen over the years. So in this video we will make it very clear as to why our favorite fire spitters have less to bless the ears, and why the idea of a classic album has basically disappeared. But first, it's very clear, don't drop a tear, drop a like and subscribe. I'm so happy you're here.
I study
rapaholics
for a living.
Now, lobbies and gentlegrams, what if I've told you we have not seen a hip-hop album go diamond since 22 years ago with the Speaker Box / The Love Below by Outkast? What if I told you that most of the albums getting streamed the most on a daily basis in 2025 are 10 to 20 years old? Drake's Take Care and Kanye West's Graduation, both released over 10 years ago, are getting more streams every day in 2025 than any album that was actually released in 2025. Ever since around 2019, it feels like there's been a void left unclosed. Don't get me wrong, we've had some major moments in music, but when it comes to an album release that feels like it bends space and time, something bigger than the artists themselves, a cultural reset so undeniable it carves its place in history, those kinds of undisputed classics in 2025 feel like a lost art.
I feel like the rap game right now is like semi-boring.
A lot of it sounds the same and stuff like that.
Exactly. You know, I just feel like everybody, like, since COVID, I feel like they put us inside, and I feel like we never came out.
Right.
You know,
right,
even though
right.
we out, we not out. Like,
Right.
the energy ain't been the same. Like I ain't been to a party yet that I've been feeling like, whoo.
And don't get me wrong, year after year, we still continue to get amazing bodies of work. But the difference between a great project and an undisputed classic is very wide. And it seems like the ultimate desire, aspiration, or mission from artists today is no longer to create that classic album. And the data backs it up. Search results for the term classic album hit a high on Google way back in 2004. They've been slowly dipping every year since, with little spikes in search results whenever we get what feels like a classic album. Notice in December 2024, right after Kendrick dropped GNX, way more people on the internet started typing the term classic album. Meanwhile, compare that to the search data for the term bad album, and you could see that the term bad album has gotten discussed more than ever on the internet starting in the 2020s decade. Ironically, also reaching its peak during a month where Kendrick Lamar had also released an album, May 2022, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. And I think this data doesn't necessarily show us that artists are dropping more bad albums than classics, but instead it shows us something much darker, in that the public's desire for classic music has slowly been dwindling. Meanwhile, the interest in trashing music or discussing what you might think is bad music has quickly been on the rise.
Hi, everyone. It's time for a Glass Animals album, the new one. It's not good.
This MGK album is not good.
Okay, say it. You better say it, review monkey boy.
This new Nav mixtape thing is not good.
You want more data to back this up? Alright, here are the best-selling albums in the 1990s.
Out of your seat and get a fire girl and catch this beat. Roll your Compton, but first let me show you something. Is at the dope, ready to make an entrance, so back on up. Before I have to pull the double G, but I somehow, some way keep coming up with beats,
so I could get some phones rolling in my ride, chilling all alone.
Tell me how you did it, there's no way I can pay you back. The plan is to show you that I understand. Out on bail, fresh out of jail, California dreaming.
Taste the track, you lock the flow. So far from hanging on the block for dough.
That's how rough riders roll. Snitches wanna try.
Do you like Primus? Wanna see me stick 9 in?
That's not the highest rated albums, not the most beloved albums. The highest selling albums How many classics did you count right there? The Chronic, Doggy Style, All Eyes on Me, Me Against the World, Slim Shady LP, that's at least 5. 5 out of the 10 best-selling albums of the 90s are wildly considered to be classic albums. Here are the most streamed albums of the 2020s. Ignore that J. Cole album, I don't know why it's in the 2020s list, but how many classics do you count off of this list? Maybe 1, 2 out of 10 if we're being generous? And I know what you're going to say. Number 1, it takes time to determine a classic album. We're going to touch on that later. And number 2, sales don't equal quality. Absolutely. But sales do determine relevance. Relevance correlates to influence. And influence is one of the most important factors of what makes a classic body of work. But like I mentioned before, we're still getting some amazing full-length bodies of work in the big 2025 that could later go on to become classics. But that impact factor is an important one. If an album isn't omnipresent, if it's something that you have to dig for instead of it just finding its way naturally to you because the entire world is talking about it to the point where you're forced to hear it, is it really a classic? We touched on the king of not good, Mr. Anthony Fantano, but take a look at his favorite albums from the 2020s decade.
We buy diabetic test strips as the thief next to Jesus. Sometimes I might be introvert. Miles, maps, scaring the hose. GNX, yes, that has made this list, of course. I feel like this record has so much going for it beyond the context that it was originally born out of. JID or JID's The Forever Story really knows his way around a verse. God Don't Make Mistakes from Conway the Machine. JPEG Mafia's LP.
All of these are likely amazing projects, but how many of them have you actually heard? Unless you're heavily tapped into the underground scene, it's likely that only 2, maybe 3 of these projects have actually made their way to your AirPods. And that's a vast contrast to what we were seeing in the 90s, where again, almost every best-selling album from that decade could now be considered a classic album. So what makes a classic album, and why don't we see them anymore? There are 8 factors that make a classic album. If your album checks off every box on this list, then you have yourself a classic. And as we go through these 8 factors, ask yourself when the last time an album checked this box for you. Number 1, a classic album must have a cohesive vision. This has always been one of the hardest factors to achieve when creating an album. It's the reason why we never got Dr. Dre's highly anticipated, mysterious, long-awaited Detox album to this day. Dr. Dre announced the album way back in 2002, and it was originally supposed to be a concept album. In an MTV interview in 2002, Dr. Dre said, "What I decided to do was make my album one story about one person and just do the record through the character's eyes. And everybody that appears on my album is going to be a character, so it's basically going to be a hip-hop musical." Denzel Washington was originally rumored to be narrating the album, while the whole album would tell the story through the perspective of a character named Detox, who was an assassin, aka a hitman. Over the years, with Dr. Dre giving some of Detox's best production to 50 Cent for Get Rich or Die Trying, or Eminem for his various albums, eventually the original vision for the project became blurred, and because the concept couldn't be executed, the project never came to fruition. But all in all, a cohesive vision doesn't necessarily mean you're telling some elaborate story. At its core, an album having some sort of cohesive vision just means that it's more than simply a collection of singles. A classic album usually has a unifying sound, theme, or a narrative. It feels like an intentional work of art, with songs that flow and complement each other. But don't take it from me. Take it from the man who has arguably given hip-hop the most classics out of any other rapper. His key to an amazing body of work is the sequencing.
The album, you want it to have an arc, right? You want it to have a beginning. I'm going to give this away for everybody can have great sequence, because I want to hear great sequence albums as well. You want it to start, want to have a build-up, just like anything else, like any great story, right? Regardless of what it is, whether it's music, movies, books, whatever, every great story in the history of time has these elements. It has a build. It comes on, it builds up to something. It has a moment of tension, of height, when it hits the height. Like on this album, that's Rock Boys and Success. It's that moment where everything is great, and then it lets you down smooth. And hopefully the last song you have is something that people walk away with and can't get out of their mind.
And like he said, there's a moment in your project where the tension builds up, and as the track list progresses, it eventually lets you down smooth. But then that last song needs to be something unforgettable. And as we go through these different factors of what makes a classic album, we're also going to look at why, again, artists are not necessarily incentivized to create projects in the modern era with the ambition or goal of giving the world the classic. Because while tracklist sequencing and cohesive visions are crucial in creating a classic, they're not necessarily conducive to creating a cash cow in the streaming era.
I think you just need to focus, first of all, with an album. You can't just go and just make an album all over the place. You won't have any focus. The songs start sounding like what you're trying to do. Like, this is my West Coast song. This is my song for the girls. This is my crossover big pop song. You know what I'm saying? If you don't have no foundation and no structure, what you want to talk about, then it just comes out all over the place.
You'll notice with a lot of albums that release nowadays, you're usually getting the best song within the first 2 to 5 songs on the album's tracklist. And that's strategic. Artists know that a listener's attention span is very short. So if you want to capture that, you got to give them your best moments right at the beginning when they first press play. Because of that, many mainstream artists today follow the exact same formula of putting their best work right at the beginning to hook in the listener. So the experience becomes predictable. And if it's not your best work right at the beginning, then it's your biggest feature. Look at Lil Baby's latest project. He knew Young Thug just came right out of jail, so placing the song he had with Thug and Future as the second song on the track list, that wasn't done with the purpose of helping the album flow better, it was done with the purpose of hooking the listener in. We could go back to 2018, you'll see the same thing on Travis Scott's Astroworld. He had his 2 biggest features, the Frank Ocean song and the Drake song, strategically placed as the second and third songs off the track list. And don't get me started on all these artists using the exact same features for all their projects. Like, for a nice 5 years, if you got a Gunna, Young Thug, Lil Baby, Future, Travis Scott, or 21 Savage album, then you were getting features on that album from all the artists I just mentioned, plus the occasional Drake verse. Everything is formulaic. Another formulaic approach, which takes away from an artist having the ability to create a cohesive sound, is the fact that they're also incentivized to put as many songs as possible on the track list to up the streams. The more songs you have, the more streams your album will collect, and the higher your album will sell. Spicy. That's why you're seeing Chris Brown do 45-song albums. That's why ever since the streaming era kicked off in 2016, every single Drake project has upwards of 23 songs. That's why all these artists are doing deluxe editions where they smack on a whole album's worth of new music onto their project. 2 questions there. Number 1, how many classics can you name off the top of your head that have over 20 songs on the track list? And number 2, if an artist's whole approach is quantity over quality, with them trying to concoct as many songs as possible, forget the album as a whole. How can you expect any of their songs to get the proper attention and quality and care that a classic track deserves? We'll answer those questions later in the video, because now we gotta touch on the second factor that makes a classic album.
You guys know I don't like Kendrick, but I've been told to react to this, and I'm gonna go in with an open mind.
Stuck in the schema.
Oh my gosh, this is so beautiful, bro.
Emotional resonance. That might sound like a fancy, prestigious term to you, but in my opinion, this is the most accurate but also the most intangible way of measuring what makes an album a classic. Ultimately, an album with strong emotional resonance consists of songs that connect deeply with the listeners, whether it's through storytelling, vulnerability, cultural references, or sheer energy. Fans keep returning to it because it evokes feelings that can't easily be found anywhere else. When you listen to a classic album, it's gotta hit you in the soul. You can accomplish that in a multitude of ways. Maybe you're trying to connect with the listener on a broader scale by capturing universal feelings like pain, hope, struggle, or triumph. That way, listeners from any background can see themselves within the music. I think that's a big reason as to why 808s and Heartbreak by Kanye West ended up becoming one of the most influential albums of our generation. The album was created right on the cusp of Kanye West losing his mother. And the reason why Kanye incorporated an immense amount of melody, auto-tune, did a complete 180 and started making tragic R&B fueled hyper-pop breakup songs is because this was the raw emotion captured at the most tragic period of his life. It's interesting to look at the dichotomy, I don't know if that's the right word, the duality maybe, of how Kanye West approaches each project, because not only does he arguably have one of the most stacked catalogs in all of hip-hop, but more so because his recording process varies based off the emotion he's trying to capture. With 808s, it was about raw, unfiltered heartbreak.
Who influenced you on this record?
Just devastation and heartbreak. And the heartbreak on top is a combination of distortion, auto-tune, delay, and actually my life's heartbreak. It's like a mixed drink.
But that type of emotion isn't necessarily derived from long-winded recording processes or immense overthinking and tweaking. To capture those raw feelings, it's gotta be what you're feeling in the spur of the moment, almost like lightning in a bottle. And that's why 808s and Heartbreak was something Kanye was able to concoct in just a matter of weeks. And his superpower behind it was following his spirit, not accommodating the vision to whatever was being played on the radio at the time.
This only took 3 weeks, I'm told. Is that accurate?
Yeah, we just I go to Hawaii to just calm down, because sometimes when I'm in New York, it's like so much stuff happening that my nerves start.
Right.
So we just went in and I just did it as an expression. And I could have just put it out as a mixtape and everything and just put it out, but I wanted people to really hear it and soak it in. And I had all these songs and these melodies in me. I also worked with Kid Cudi, who made the song Day and Night. I toss and turn, it's on my mind. Mr. Hudson, a few different R&B artists were down there. We decided to just not worry about what was on the radio at that time.
Just do it.
Yeah, just do it. Just do it quickly, yeah.
But certain emotions, like triumph, probably take more precision to carefully embody such a powerful feeling. That's why on Kanye's next album, what fans would deem his undisputed classic, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, he spent 5,000 hours crafting perfection on the lead single, Power, and then ended up spending 8 months concocting the entire project, a vast contrast from the few weeks that it took him to make 808s and Heartbreak.
I started the album really January 1st. I got focused and was down in Hawaii just grinding every day. The song like Power took 5,000 hours, like literally 5,000 man hours to do this one record. And that's the amount of time I was putting into every song.
That moment when I thought about taking Nicki's verse off of Monster, because I knew people would say that was the best verse on the best hip-hop album of all time, or arguably top 10 albums of all time, right? And I would do all that work, 8 months of work on Dark Fantasy, and people to this day would say to me, oh, my favorite thing was Nicki Minaj's verse. So if I let my ego get the best of me, instead of letting that girl get the shot to get that platform and become all she could be, I would take it off or marginalize her, try to stop her from having that shining moment. As disruptive as that Nicki Minaj Monster verse was, is how disruptive the Yeezys were. People hadn't felt that feeling since the Jordans.
But emotional resonance isn't necessarily just constrained to feelings like triumph or pain, etc. Sometimes a classic project can reflect lived experiences in a way that feels raw and unfiltered, and as a result creates memory anchors to where the songs get tied directly to moments in people's lives or even embody physical places. Sometimes a classic album just has to give you a panoramic view of what's going on in the community that an artist grew up in. Look at Illmatic, for example.
But when he made that One Love, that spoke to me. He talked about suffering. He talked about struggle. He talked about what it meant to be a drug dealer. He talked about what it meant to be a victim of crime. That album gave us, in Précis, a kind of panoramic vision of what it meant to be a young black person struggling for survival. So the fact is, we teach at Harvard, at Georgetown, at Princeton, the works of these gifted artists because they have something profound and important. And I think, just as we study Hemingway, I think we study a Nas to understand the verbal invention.
Albums like that can speak to a neighborhood, speak to a culture so poignantly and move its people emotionally to the point where they evolve and grow based off the inspiration they got from the project itself.
Let me tell you something, I had so many fights before Illmatic came out, and when Illmatic came out, I ain't gonna lie, I had at least 2 weeks I didn't fight. Wow. Because niggas was like, y'all Queens got it.
And as your career evolves, you try and get bigger. So while Illmatic created a snapshot of what it meant to be a young black man growing up in Queensbridge, with his next release, Nas was trying to take it bigger. He was trying to resonate emotionally with the entire world.
As an album, how is It Was Written different from Illmatic?
Sound-wise is that musically, we just wanted to aim at, more people than just Queensbridge, you know what I mean? As a musician, you grow. It's Queensbridge music, but we didn't want to keep it out here just that, like that. We want to give it to everybody. We want everybody to vibe with us, because everybody going through the same thing. Lyrically, it may talk about different points of views since Illmatic, since I've grown.
Similar to Illmatic, Kendrick Lamar's first classic album captured that exact same feeling almost 20 years later, but for the other side of America. Good Kid, Mad City captured that same feeling for a young Compton kid in the 2010s as Illmatic did for the East Coast youth in the 90s. It's structured like a film, the entire album narrating a day in the life of a teenager navigating faith, family, peer pressure, and violence. People called it a short movie because it immersed listeners into a lived reality. That reality plus cinematic scope is why it became an instant classic. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the concept of a project that connects with the listener on a level that makes it a classic in their eyes. Sometimes it could be as simple as, in the case of hip-hop classics, how well a rapper's actually rapping from a technical perspective all throughout the project. Like, I'll always look at mixtapes from Lil Wayne, like The Drought 3 or No Ceilings, as classics in my eyes, just because I remember being a kid being blown away at just how wild Wayne's punchlines were and how good he was at just building these bars and delivering them in such an animated way. But don't take my opinion on a classic album. Eminem actually feels the exact same way about another classic album we just spoke about, Nas's Illmatic. What resonated with M emotionally wasn't how it sounded or what Nas was saying, or the environment or time period that the album emotionally brought you back to, but instead, M holds it in such a high regard just due to the sheer pure lyrical craftsmanship that project possesses.
One of the reasons that I picked Halftime though is because there's some rhyme schemes on there that most rappers to this day probably can't do. And that's one of the things that has made Nas so great over his career. I be slaying him fast, doing this, that, and the third, but chill past the entree and let's lay a back up at John Jay and hit a matinee.
And keeping it on Nas for a second and how great of a lyricist he is, artists like him will sometimes actually approach their classic albums with the intention of not having this larger-than-life, incredible production, letting that take a back seat so that the audience can actually resonate with the content and the bars and the message within the project. Nas did an interview where he allegedly said that he makes it a point on each one of his albums to give you that one banger to tide you over, but ultimately the way he executes the project is by letting the instrumentals and the production take a back seat and picking beats that don't actually match the quality of his lyrical abilities on purpose. So it forces you to pay attention to what he's actually saying, and if you end up doing so, it's likely that his music will move you in a way that very few artists can, because it's almost like a pattern interrupt for your ear. Your ear is focusing on something that your mind isn't necessarily used to.
The stereotype is Nas picks bad beats. I think that's a stupid stereotype that hip-hop is just taking on.
But he rapped on a lot of bad beats, though. I interviewed him, and I asked him about that.
This was The Source?
Yeah. I asked him why he did that. And he goes, I want people to pay more attention to what I'm saying and what the beat sounds like. You can't ever think that I don't get offered every beat under the sun from every producer under the sun.
For sure.
And I kind of gave him like a little side eye, and he said, think about it. I always give you one. I know what you want. Every album, I give you at least one or two. I make it a point to do that. He basically said, I don't want the beat to be more important than what I'm saying.
Now, this is definitely a unique approach to creating a catalog that many would argue has multiple classics in it. And that leads us into the third component of what defines a classic album. And that is originality and innovation. This could be something as simple as J. Cole creating his best album with no features, and that project being remembered for him going platinum with no help. Or it could be as complex as Kanye spending thousands of hours reworking every single song on a project like Dark Twisted Fantasy. Or if you want to look at something more abstract, you could make the argument for something like Future's project DS2 being a modern day classic, not for its lyrical complexity, but instead for the originality and innovation that it brought to trap music. It literally redefined what mainstream trap could sound and feel like. It defined the aesthetic of the trap music subgenre of hip-hop for the next damn near decade as we led into the SoundCloud era. DS2's dark, hypnotic production or the drug-heavy, emotionally numb themes all throughout Future's music at that time became the blueprint for those artists of the future. No pun intended.
Spicy.
And that actually leads me into a major point in terms of why I feel like we see less classic albums or even superstars within this generation, because everything seems to be following a formula. Go watch the Playboi Max Song Wars that just happened, where he's trying to shine a light on the up-and-coming underground scene that the youth, I guess, is listening to, and come back to me and tell me that half of these guys don't sound like Playboi Carti. And then look at every era that came before the 2020s. The 2010s brought Drake, who didn't sound like Kendrick, who didn't sound like J. Cole, who didn't sound like Big Crit, who didn't sound like Meek Mill, who didn't sound like Big Sean or Wale, etc. And in the 2000s, there was even more diversity. I'll let Nelly tell you guys about that.
But you gotta understand, my era of music was the toughest era in hip-hop ever. When I put out songs, I had to go against DMX, Eminem, Jay-Z, Eminem, Lil Wayne, 50 Cent, Luda.
Yeah.
All of us are fighting for one spot. So from 99 to like 2008, 10, it's the hardest era ever.
My point is, back then it seemed like in order to actually blow up and become a star, you needed to have some sort of unique star power, some originality, some sort of innovation you were bringing to the game with your quote-unquote classic projects, if you had any. It's hard to get a classic project out of the biggest artists today because a lot of them are riding a formula in either one of two ways. Number one, you're either an artist who is following the blueprint or the sound or the flows or the production style or the aesthetic of another artist. We see that very frequently with all the Playboi Carti clones running around today, or the future offsprings, the Young Thug offsprings. I mean, even like some of the biggest superstars today, Don Toliver. Yeah, they have their own style, but you hear Don Toliver, you immediately think Travis Scott. Back in the day, when you heard Nelly, you didn't think Kanye West, you didn't think Ludacris, you didn't think Lil Wayne. They all had their own unique pocket. And number two, the whole thing about, following formulas and how that hinders artists from releasing classic projects. Again, we're talking about the factor of innovation and originality. A lot of these artists, they strike gold with a certain type of sound or flow, and from then on, it gets very hard to actually innovate or change that sound because they know they already have a blueprint that works. Like to me, over the last 5 years, NBA YoungBoy, who is considered one of the biggest artists in hip-hop today, has shown virtually no evolution in his sound or subject matter over the last 5 years. Maybe I'm wrong. Even an artist like Lil Uzi Vert, who has one of the biggest songs so far of 2026 with What You Sayin', that's kind of like a B-side to the Jersey Club smash hit that he had back in 2023 with I Just Wanna Rock. He found a formula, it struck gold, and now he's just rinse and repeating.
I study formula for a living.
As much as I love, a lot of the artists under the Griselda umbrella, you can make the argument that they've also found the formula and they stick to it. And let's bring it back to Nas for a second, because remember how I said earlier when we were talking about emotional resonance. A lot of people who grew up around the same time and in the same environment as Nas back when he released Illmatic, they felt like that album encapsulated what it felt like to be someone growing up in Queens in that time period. Well, just to highlight the innovative mindset that Nas had been in at the time, while he realized that his first album that many consider his best work was a snapshot of his hometown, with his next project, he was focused on expanding that much further and completely doing a 180 and instead trying to touch the entire world instead of just his neighborhood.
As an album, how is It Was Written different from Illmatic?
Sound-wise is that musically, we just wanted to aim at, more people than just Queensbridge, you know what I mean? As a musician, you grow.
In order to have multiple classic albums in your discography, that's the type of mindset you have to approach your music with. How can I evolve? How can I get bigger and better? Kendrick Lamar is the perfect example of this, right? When Good Kid, Mad City came out, he could have kept going in a similar direction sonically and gave us a million more Mad Cities, Money Trees. These are some of his biggest songs. If he was thinking like a capitalist, maybe he would have tried to recreate that sound over and over again, especially to avoid, falling into that sophomore slump that happens to a lot of artists. But instead, he admitted he can never make another Good Kid, Mad City again because that was his first. That was him telling you his life story up until that point. But from that point going forward, he had to evolve. To make another classic, you can't make the same thing over again. You gotta stay innovative.
You know, it's even tough for me to perform them on stage because when you're in the creative mode, you want to be in a space where you're on to something new. You're on to something even more special, and you're bettering yourself. And that's how a lot of artists stay stagnant. Because they say you have a classic album, you want to just uphold and just do it all over again. At the same time, I'll never be able to make another Good Kid, Mad City. You know why? Because it was my first album. I watch artists and I'm a student, and you got to be aware of that first before you go into your next project. You got to be able to make the next classic and not, the same.
And it didn't just stop with To Pimp a Butterfly or Good Kid, Mad City. I'm sure a lot of you guys know the theory that every single Kendrick Lamar album takes on a different form of media. So it's to the point with his catalog where it's not even that sonically every album kind of stands on its own, but even in the way that it's packaged and structured, each project is a major evolution from the last.
I'm not sure if you ever noticed this, but there's actually a connection between each and every single Kendrick Lamar album, and it's that they each represent a different media format. So let's start off with Section 80. This is actually a novel. If you pay attention to songs like Chapter 6 and 10, if you pay attention to the narrator, the way that it starts off the album with everyone telling personal stories, it feels like a book and a novel. Then you go on to GKMC, it's obviously a movie, a short film by Kendrick Lamar on the title. Not only that, but if you pay attention to the track list and even all the skits, extremely cinematic, you can listen to it in different orders, it feels like a movie. Then To Pimp a Butterfly is actually a poem and is poetry, because if you go through the track list, there's a poem to Tupac that's instilled within the writing of the album. Then you go on to Damn, that's a magazine. If you pay attention to the font on the top of Damn, it replicates the same font as Time magazine, and if you pay attention to every single song, it's formatted like a headline. Then, if you go on to Miss Merle and the Big Steppers, it's actually a theater play. If you go into the album, you see that there's different acts, and within the narration, Whitney actually admits that, hey, we're going into Act 2 now.
And of course, it's very hard to recreate the magic of your first project, which is why a lot of artists maybe never even see a classic album because they bear their whole life on that first one. And then after that, you get signed by a major label, you got timelines, you got budgets, you got constraints artistically. The label expects a certain sound. That's why those sophomore slumps happen so frequently. But a big conversation today is, does any rapper actually have more than 4 classic albums? My contribution to that conversation would be, I think Jay-Z and Kanye West could take the cake there, and I think when it's all said and done, Kendrick will be up there as well. But I think that definitely ties into the innovation conversation, right? In order for an album to be considered classic, I think there has to be an either originality factor or an innovation factor, where your project sounds like nothing we've ever heard before, to the point where 10 years down the line, we got to look at it as classic because it just stood out so much from everything else that was happening in that moment. But that could actually work against an artist as well, because if you're trying too hard to be different, sometimes it doesn't end up resonating with enough people where it ends up going and standing the test of time to become that classic project.
He said no rapper has 4 classic albums. People think it's a few people with 4 classic albums. They got 5, cause they were saying Kanye, it was like, they said Kanye got 5 classics straight out the gate. It was like, that sounds ridiculous. I don't know. Y'all know anybody with 4 classics? I think Hov definitely got 4 classics. Yeah. I think Kanye might got 4 too, though, to be honest.
And like I said, I think in 10, 20 years from now, we'll have a better idea of who really has 4 or more classic albums, especially within hip hop. But that leads us into the 4th actual category of what defines a classic album, and that would be timelessness. What do I mean by timelessness? Well, essentially, in order for an album to be a classic, it's got to still feel relevant, it's got to be enjoyable, it's got to be powerful decades down the line. It's got to transcend every trend that you've seen in every generation that came after this album released. Listeners from every and any generation should be able to connect with a certain aspect of this album in order for it to be a classic. And that's actually why when people have the debate over whether or not Drake has any classic projects, as much as you guys think I hate on Drake, I actually think he does have several classics. And I think it's due to this factor right here, the timelessness factor. Because when you go back and listen to a Take Care or a Nothing Was the Same, I think whether you're a fan of R&B, hip hop, pop, whatever the case is, you will take something from both of those projects that you genuinely enjoy on a high level. You didn't have to live in the blog era to be able to connect with those projects. Now, sadly, I think the same thing that made those projects and made Drake great back in the day are the same reasons why not only him, but many artists today are unable to make a classic album, because it doesn't feel like he goes back to the intention or the vision that he had when he was creating those projects. What do I mean by that? Well, we're talking about timelessness, right? Something that can stand the test of time, but How do you make something that can transcend generations, that can have that longevity, when the way we consume music today is so constrained to a timeline? I mean, with the way social media is engineered today and algorithms, everyone's kind of incentivized to give their hot take on an album so quickly, right? It's either an instant classic or it's instantly trash. We don't live with the projects and let them age in a timeless manner. And at the same time, artists are aware of this. They're trying to constantly feed our attention spans and our algorithms, which are slowly shrinking, right? So in order to do that, you got to be constantly visible. You got to be constantly dropping projects. You're not focused on how to create something that might sound amazing in 10 years from now. You're focused on creating something that will click instantly. We're going to go deeper into that concept later in the video, but timelessness is an interesting concept because you could love something and in 5-10 years from now, like the sound of it, the subject matter, or even something as minute as like the artist's voice can hit completely differently than it did back when you first heard it. Like for me, I remember in the pandemic era when Lil Baby dropped his album My Turn. That was like the biggest project of that year, right? Kids who were like in middle school, high school at that time period, when they were growing up off that project, like 10 years later, they would probably look at that as a classic of their generation. However, when you look at it today, just because of how the landscape has shifted, how Lil Baby's sound has kind of stagnated, it's hard to listen to that project in the same lens. It didn't necessarily age the way people thought it would. The same thing with Chance the Rapper. He had some amazing bodies of work, but for me, the second he dropped The Big Day, his debut album in 2019, that thing was so bad that even going back to his older music, it made it feel like that music that I once loved aged worse just because of this new perception I had of Chance as an artist. That kind of cleared up once he dropped Starline. But I say all that to say, it's very common that you can love an album in the moment, but what makes it classic, what separates it, is that you can go back to it 10 years later on the 400th listen and it can feel the exact same way that it did when you first heard it 10 years beforehand. Take a look at Eminem, who arguably has 3 classics under his belt. I'm sure he wouldn't release anything in the moment that he thought wasn't worthy or couldn't stand up to the quality of his first 3 projects, but in hindsight, when he looks back on some of these albums like Encore and Relapse, it doesn't have that timelessness factor that his first 3 projects do. Even he could admit it.
Albums that definitely probably would not be the top of my list. Encore. Okay. Relapse, which I believe Encore is a better album than Relapse. Relapse is something that I looked at in a couple of years, went back to and cringed at. I was like, oh, Jesus Christ, I didn't even realize I was doing that many accents.
Now, it's one thing if a classic project transcends generations. It's a whole other ballgame if a classic project actually inspires the next generation. And that brings us into the 5th factor of what makes a classic album, and that is cultural impact. This means that this album was such a force in time that it influenced the direction of music, it inspired other artists, maybe it sparked a whole new movement, or sometimes it can even transcend music and stretch its influence and affect different areas of culture like fashion. You could think of staples from every generation within hip-hop specifically that contain classic albums that meet this criteria of having deep cultural impact. In the 90s, you had projects like Dr. Dre's The Chronic that defined the G-Funk sound, launched the West Coast into the mainstream in the 90s, and Dr. Dre's production and his sound became a staple within that decade. Then in the 2000s, albums like Get Rich or Die Trying revived gangsta rap in the mainstream and also influenced entire fashion trends with the whole G-Unit gear. Plus, it shifted a big focus towards, the emphasis on hooks. Like 50's hook game on that project was next level. Him and Nelly with Country Grammar. Or look at something like To Pimp a Butterfly. That went far beyond the confines of just being influential within music and became a centerpiece of political and social discourse. And in several instances, even something as superficial as success can sometimes translate into cultural impact. I think there's very few rappers who are more impactful on this current generation than someone like Lil Wayne. And when we think of his classic album, I mean, some people look at the Carter 2, that some people would be me, but a large portion of mainstream America, when Wayne was really at his most impactful, his most influential, looks at the Carter 3 as his magnum opus, right? And one of the major things we remember about that project is him selling 1 million in the first week during a recession, right? And I know beforehand I brought up how, a major reason why we don't see classic albums today is because artists are more focused on chasing trends, following formulas, and really just displaying a vision of quantity over quality. And I know that Wayne had that back then with all the mixtapes and the features. And, you know, I mean, there was a whole separate version of the Carter 3 before we got the main one that was leaked online. But the way the game was structured back then, if you were a major artist that, you know, had the skill set to deliver a classic album, your team would usually be incentivized to help ensure that that actually comes to fruition. What do I mean by that? Well, yeah, Lil Wayne had a bunch of hits around this time. The Carter 3 itself had 3 top 10 Billboard hits, but if you know Wayne, you know he doesn't pick his singles or the songs that even make it onto the track list. There were entire departments at the label whose sole job it was to clear his records and pick his records for the albums. For an artist who strictly focused on recording like a studio junkie, having a strong team who can actually construct the sequencing behind your album is a major plus. And this is something that would benefit this generation massively, especially, you know, the SoundCloud era rappers who usually do take that quantity over quality approach, but we'll touch on why that is actually a hindrance to this generation not cooking up nearly as many classic albums later in this video. But take a look at what it meant for Wayne to kind of hit that level of cultural impact that he did with, again, what many consider his magnum opus, the Carter 3.
How did the Carter 3 change the trajectory for you?
I think that was probably the first time we noticed, you know what I mean, for me, I started really getting that praise, you know, and I started really loving it, embracing it. But at that time around that album, definitely was when, you know, just seeing people in the street or just hearing from other artists. I think at that time, so the confidence was strong.
1 million units. Did you trip out? Clearly you knew the album was dope, but did you think that was possible to do? Because you did that back to back.
I come from them days where we as an artist, I mean like a juvenile beat, we checking the Billboard magazine to see where this and that. I remember those, that don't exist now, you know what I mean? So when we dropped The Block Is Hot, it sold like 114,000 the first week or 95,000, and that was the equivalent and the impact of selling 1 million point something a week. And I remember I was like, wow, I'm just can't do nothing but thank God.
Now, Wayne is an interesting figure because you either love him or you hate him. I mean, if you were on YouTube in 2008, you remember, you know, 90% of YouTube users would tell you Lil Wayne killed hip hop. But 20 years later, with him selling 1 million in the first week during a recession with the Carter 3, many people look at the Carter 3 today as a classic. But another factor that Wayne necessarily didn't always have that definitely is important when you want to judge a classic album is universal acclaim. Now, this stretches far beyond just, you know, critics or in the modern age, streamers or, you know, reactors. This kind of blends into the whole timelessness factor of what makes a classic album, because it's not about, you know, whether everyone loves the album on day one when it's first released. It's more so, how is that album perceived or how does it age when it's all said and done? For example, something like Dark Twisted Fantasy by Kanye, that was getting 9 out of 10s by almost every single critic right when it first came out, and today you would say that that album still deserves probably around a 9 on 10. Ironically, Anthony Fantano did not give that album a 9 on 10, he gave it like a 6, but he also had a very low score for something like Mac Miller's Swimming. However, over time, he actually reassessed his evaluation of the project and ended up having a new love and new praise for it, given the added layer of context of understanding where Mac Miller was at the time he recorded it and the themes that he's actually exploring on that project. Sometimes it takes a little bit of lived experience with an album to actually be able to appreciate and love it for what it truly is. But something that comes with almost every classic album is the fact that a high majority of listeners can all unanimously agree that there is one or several aspects of that project that are exceptionally well crafted. And going back to someone who, again, I think has some of the most classics within hip hop, Kanye West, well, he wanted on his debut album for every aspect of the project to be as well crafted as possible, and for him to be the one responsible for the execution of all of these amazing elements. What do I mean by that? Well, he had no money at the beginning to actually produce The College Dropout, and he was known at first as a producer, but he also had access to all these incredible producers around him because he was, heavily affiliated with Jay-Z. He could have called Just Blaze, Timbaland, No ID, whoever, but he decided to handle most of the production on The College Dropout instead. He went through insane hurdles to prove not just to himself, but to the industry that he deserved to be in that spot. He deserved to be the most acclaimed because he was doing the most.
Allow myself to introduce myself. This is Kanye to as far as dealing with other producers, there's a lot of producers I respect. Timbaland, Dre, Bink, Just Blaze, I can name them all. But on this project right here, I'm gonna do 99% of it because I feel like I really gotta prove to the world that I can do a whole project and then be successful. It just so happened that the project is me, myself, so I'm gonna definitely give myself some bangers, some heat rocks.
Now, I think this factor as to, why an album could be a classic, the whole universal acclaim element, that's actually a major pitfall as to why we don't see classic albums nearly as much in 2026. Remember how I was saying that Lil Wayne used to have an entire team who was sequencing his albums, picking the track list, clearing the records, all that stuff? Yeah, well, a lot of those job positions don't exist today in 2026, and that's the biggest reason, in my opinion, why we do not see nearly as many classics albums as we used to. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm talking about the death of the A&R. A&R's roles used to be to discover new talent and then help develop that talent so that they were well positioned to not just have, a hot single or even like one big album, but to actually have a long-standing career. Those artists that those A&Rs would discover were like their baby or their investment, right? And how this ties into universal acclaim is that it stresses the importance of sometimes hearing an outside voice when crafting a project, right? Remember Kanye used to have Rick Rubin barefoot in the studio, like listening to his Yeezus album, crafting it with him. Well, it used to be very common that there would be A&Rs at labels that their sole role was to listen to the music that artists were crafting and basically give it a direction, right? Let's say one hook that this artist made needed a feature and they thought it would go well with this other artist. Or let's say you had this whole album, but it was kind of just a bunch of songs put together and we had this deadline of 2 months from now and we got to cut these songs. This song would transition well into that song. These songs don't really fit the concept or the sound of the project. Like the A&R basically helps direct or quality control the whole project as it's being created. Unfortunately, with the rise of the digital and streaming era, many of these A&R jobs have been shrunk or cut altogether. In 2025 alone, forget about just the A&Rs for a second, 17,000 plus jobs were actually lost in the media and entertainment space. And with the rise of the internet, it's very easy to discover talent, right? So in today's day and age, an A&R's role is less about discovering talent or developing these artists. It's more about analyzing data and streaming metrics, which is problematic because then you start getting these labels who enforce, chasing trends and chasing formulas onto their artists because they're only focused on the numbers and the data and what's working from a viewership or a sales perspective. Plus, I described to you guys what the A&R's role was, right? They were almost like a gatekeeper. Like if you had a crappy song, odds are if you had a strong A&R in the room, he's not going to put that on the final track list of the album, right? But in today's day and age, around 1 million songs are released on streaming platforms per week, which obviously massively reduces the need for these traditional gatekeeper A&Rs. You could just go release a bunch of slop onto Spotify, and if something sticks, it sticks. Artists can now blow up independently off of TikToks, so these A&Rs at labels don't need to discover the talent early on anymore. Because of that, labels now sign what's already working. Their goal is not to really develop artists, it's just to kind of maintain what's already been proven. And at the same time, the streaming data, all these numbers, the TikTok viewership, all that stuff, that has replaced the instinct that these A&Rs used to be valuable for. Used to have a guy in the studio listening to the music with the artist, understanding the vision behind the project, and offering insight based off how the music made them feel and what they knew a hit sounded like. You can't quantify that. You can't put that into numbers, right? But the algorithms have pretty much replaced what A&Rs used to do, right? Like sounds will get trending on TikTok and the label money just basically chases that. No A&Rs around anymore, no quality control on the albums getting released, and no real need to actually have universally acclaimed albums, like albums that the whole universe can point out something amazing about, because an artist doesn't need a classic album right now to cement themselves. They just need a hot single. So that was a very important factor to what makes a classic album that's no longer as relevant today in 2026. But another factor that is more important and relies solely on the artist is the consistency of the tracklist or the attention to detail. When you think of a classic album, you don't think of a bunch of slop thrown together, right? You don't think of 12 tracks just placed together randomly. There's got to be intention behind it. There's got to be attention to detail. That is a key factor that makes a classic album. And when I say attention to detail, I'm talking about the nittiest of grittiest details to the world that you're building around this project that you hope to be a classic, right? Look at 50 Cent with Get Rich or Die Trying, right? He analyzed all of the classic albums within hip-hop throughout history and realized they're all based off the concept of life and death. So he decided to name his classic album Get Rich or Die Trying.
Well, it's like, you gotta look and say, the universal theme that worked the best for hip-hop artists is life and death.
Oh, the Biggie.
Yeah. Biggie, Ready to Die, Life After Death, and Tupac, Machiavelli, these are all life and death theme records. You know what I mean? So when I add a little bit of aspiration to it, I say Get Rich or Die Trying.
Oh,
that's great.
Kendrick Lamar also had that keen attention to detail on the titles of his albums, because his album Damn wasn't actually supposed to be named Damn. It was initially supposed to be named What Happens on Earth Stays on Earth. But in the end, he thought that title would be too long. I think that would have been a crazy title, but like I'm saying, there's an intention behind everything, right?
Then I feel or look at words that I feel like capture that emotion, you know. So we was going through that back and forth all through the whole process.
Did you ever have another album title for Damn?
Yep.
What was it?
What Happened on Earth Stays on Earth.
What Happens on Earth
Stays on Earth.
Why not that? That's a long ass title.
It's a long. There you go.
You know what I'm saying? That's Kendrick Lamar. What Happens on Earth? What is
And the album title is just one aspect of the details that artists are obviously paying attention to, right? I mean, 50 Cent with Get Rich or Die Trying was so careful with the tempo of all the songs off the track list and had this mission of keeping everything sounding cohesive to the point where, in my opinion, the best song off the album, Many Men, almost didn't make the final cut because it didn't go with the overall sonic direction that Get Rich or Die Trying had taken on the rest of the track list. He was so obsessed with the details, trying to perfect the overall body of work, that he was ready to make the massive sacrifice of leaving off arguably the best song off that project, just so the project had this perfect type of feeling.
The only song that almost didn't make that album was Many Men. Whoa! And it was because of the tempo. Broke my heart. It was slower than the other records, I wanted to keep everybody up. And then Dre was like, nah, that gotta go. You gotta keep that one.
And creating these classic cinematic albums that have, such a keen attention to detail, they were expensive, right? I mean, Kanye West, for example, used to spend more creating one single album than me, for example, has spent and earned combined in my entire lifetime.
Of what we do and what we make, like our music, part of the reason why it's so much better is, like, obviously you got super mega talents, but it costs a lot to make this album too. We was in Saudi, Italy, flights, car service, strippers, it was expensive. With our music, they acting like this ain't even luxury, like it don't deserve to have this moment where people who truly appreciate, the people come out to the theater, the people who, talk about every line and want to hear it and see the listening sessions, those early adopters, like, it's just supposed to be like, just free. Like, even like, here's an example. Somebody I was working with put the album for $5 on my site. Everyone know my site at Yeezy.com is $20 for everything. Right. Then my album, like, this album costs millions of dollars to make, hardship, overcoming like personal threats to everyone.
Now, when I say, this is an important factor that makes or breaks a classic album, I don't mean that you have to be so meticulous with every single aspect of the creation, right? That's just a factor that can definitely enhance the listening experience. However, Sometimes the consistency of the tracklist can actually derive from the fact that you created the thing in a much more carefree, emotionally vulnerable state and didn't focus so much on the little details. To me, and I'm sure to most of you, as long as you don't stare at a tracklist and see like 20% of it being filler, like most of these songs are memorable or strong in their own right, and the overall quality feels elevated compared to what the rest of the game is doing at the time, those projects will have a much higher likelihood of aging to be classics in their own right. Now, another reason why you may not get classics today like you did in the past is because the new generation doesn't not only care about making classics, they'd rather make singles, but they also don't care about listening to the classic albums that came before them in full. Like, do you think Yeet has ever sat down with his headphones and listened to the Blueprint front to back? Well, I could kind of answer that for you indirectly, because Lil Yachty had said that he had only heard Jay-Z's classic albums by the year 2024. And keep in mind, he's been in the game since like 2015.
When they were asking you about a feature that you really want, I'm surprised you didn't say Jay-Z.
I listened to the Black Album for the first time like 3 days ago.
God damn.
And then I listened to Reasonable Doubt.
What do you think?
I think that the Reasonable Doubt was better, in my opinion. Obviously, he's an insane lyricist.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of like that type, that like sound, but like I think he's sick.
Yeah.
And I think the shit he talks about is like shit most people never actually get to experience in life. So.
Yeah. Have you met him before?
Yeah, of course.
Good dude?
I mean, as far as I've met.
Now this brings us into the final factor that makes a classic album. Could be the most important of all of them, and that'll be the longevity of the album's influence. How the album actually affects culture over time, but not necessarily that it has to birth a new sound or influence artists to kind of try and replicate the sound of that project. It just has to continue to be referenced, played, and discussed years later. Now, I know that I said that one of the factors earlier on was timelessness with a project. The difference between timelessness and longevity of influence, timelessness is how the album feels over time, right? Like if you play a project today that came out 10 years ago, does it still sound good? Is it still somewhat relevant? Does it still connect with listeners across generations? If it does, then it's timeless. But if it has that longevity, that means it transcends time. It deserves a spot in a museum. It's infected culture, not infected, affected culture in many different facets, many different ways. And it's more than just enjoyable over time, but it's still impactful over time. This is the reason to me why you cannot deem something a classic off the first week, off the first listen. And Kendrick Lamar agrees. It's not just you, but the world has to live with this album before it can be called a classic, right? The world itself has got to change before we know if this album has aged gracefully throughout those changes.
I mean, that's the thing that I say with the word classic and instant classic album. Me putting To Pimp a Butterfly out, I mean, you hear the speculation of kids saying that all over again prior to when we put Good Kid, Mad City out. And I always told them, listen to the music a few times, man, before we start throwing words out like that, even when it's on my behalf, because I want you to live with it. You know what I'm saying? I want it to be first listen and you like it, or first listen and you have an opinion. Live with it, grow with it, because at the end of the day, I make albums that have that type of longevity. If not, I can just give you a whole bunch of singles on one record. You feel what I'm saying?
Now, what's funny, you guys, is I actually recorded the first half of this video in August of 2025, and I don't know why I set it to the side. And then this whole new conversation emerged with, the debate of whether or not Drake has any classic albums within hip-hop, and I thought, it'd be a good time to actually re-explore this topic and finalize this video. But what I find ironic is throughout the research of the video, I found an old debate of Akademiks and Joe Budden on Everyday Struggle in 2017. Keep in mind, this was when Drake just released his album, More Life. So there was a whole lot of new timeline additions that did not happen by this point in time. They were debating whether or not Drake had any classics back then. Joe Budden had said that by 2020, we would be viewing Take Care as a classic. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of the longevity of an album, right? You might not feel like something's a classic in the moment or even 5, 6, 7 years after it's released. But how does that album continue to be talked about in decades from now? How does it continue to impact or inspire the next generation? How does that music sound when you hear it today in a gym or in the clubs or in the grocery store, wherever it is? If it hits the same way it did back in the day and people are still talking about this album as if it's relevant today, that's that longevity that is very hard to emulate, and that no doubt makes a classic album. And it's interesting to hear Joe say in 2017 that it wasn't a classic yet, but he thought you give it a couple more years, you let a new decade emerge, you let a new generation of artists continue to dominate the charts with that, heavy Drake influence probably in them. And by then, you'd be having a whole different conversation about whether or not Take Care was a classic. Now, why I said this was ironic is because when you hear Akademiks' opinions on Drake's music back then versus now, especially when comparing them to, Joe Budden, who he was debating, maybe he's a paid agent on Drake because he was not the most favorable in terms of believing that Drake truly had all these classics that he now thinks Drake does.
How many classic albums? How many classic albums does Drake have? Over or under one? One?
Is So Far Gone an album?
We could consider it for this conversation.
So if it's one, you said over, under one.
Shouldn't that be two?
I always get beat up for this, man. They always attack me for this. I don't know if the public recognizes Take Care as a classic.
That's going to be my point, but continue.
And I'm aware of that.
Okay.
I think that if not today, by 2020, we are going to recognize that album as a classic album.
Okay.
So I'm going over.
So you're going over.
So Far Gone, Take Care.
Okay, so you're saying two. Now, my whole problem with that is we usually, and we've had this discussion about classics before, we usually say it's hard to say something's a classic when it first came out, even the year after, the year after.
Sit there like this, right?
Nah,
Put it down.
But Take Care came out in 2011. We're in 2017. It's 6 years later.
Okay.
So if 6 years later we're still in doubt and we're now projected maybe in 8 more years or 5 more years, maybe it'll be acknowledged. Maybe the culture hasn't accepted it. Maybe it's really just Drake fans. To me, that album is, every time I listen to a Drake, that's why I wasn't that mad at Views, because he was trying a little bit to get Take Care. Didn't really accomplish it, but he tried. I like Views. I always want a Take Care Part 2. I want him and The Weeknd to link up to make that shit. It's a personal classic to me. Does the culture consider it a classic?
No.
I'm gonna say no.
No.
So I'm not considering that a classic.
But, not to interrupt you, but I think part of the reason the culture refuses to recognize that album as a classic is because it came out, it was his second album, Drake was on fire like we've never seen before. I think the public assumed he would continue to accelerate at a rate we've never seen. So we're not going to call that album classic because let's see what's coming. I think he has enough of a discography now to make the assumption that, Take Care is peak Drake.
And also, if we're also evaluating his album, by the way, I'm saying under. I'm going to go under. If I'm talking personally, I would go over, but I'm thinking about how the culture is going to see his work.
And I think when you're asking yourself why we don't see, as many classics today as we used to back in the day, longevity plays a huge role in that. Because in today's day and age, like I mentioned before, we got these much faster consumption cycles, right? Like according to the music analytics firm Luminate, they say an average of 120,000 new tracks are uploaded to music streaming services every single day. And this was a statistic from Q1 of 2023, which means that number has probably grown exponentially. But think about that, you guys, 120,000 new tracks every single day from all across the world. This is around 840,000 new songs that are released per week. When you have that vast of a quantity of music being released at all times, that number only continuing to grow, more people trying to make it, and the internet making it easier and easier for you to release and record all this music. As an artist, how do you even, create with the vision of building something that will live on in 10, 20 years from now when the whole world is moving at such a faster pace, right? It's very similar to YouTube content, and it's ironic because this was actually a video that I did a lot of research on, almost a year ago, and I'm only revisiting it now a year later. But for the most part, like, I could spend 3 months on a video and it could completely flop. And at that point, this is how I earn, a living to actually eat and stuff, right? So I could put all this passion, all this hard work into creating the best video ever, spend 3 months on it, not post for that entire time. And because I was completely inactive for those 3 months, the algorithm likely assumes that the audience that was following me 3 months ago has likely forgot about me. And the whole point of the algorithm is to predict what you'd want to watch next, right? Or in the case of Spotify with music, it predicts what you want to hear next. So they're not in the business of, rewarding the best quality of music. They're in the business of rewarding whatever will catch your attention the fastest. So odds are, if you didn't see me for 3 months because I was working on a really big project, once I dropped that project, it probably wouldn't do that well. Meanwhile, if I drop a video every single day, but the quality is absolutely horrible, I'd probably make a lot more money and get a lot more views than I do when I actually take my time to produce something of quality. Look at an artist like NBA Youngboy, right? He's got like 12 billion streams on Spotify throughout his whole career. Does he have a classic album? No, but he's got a brand new song out every week to keep you locked in, to keep your attention span focused on him, right? And everyone's trying to be the next NBA Youngboy at this point in time if you're a young up-and-coming rapper, right? Or even on a bigger scale, a lot of these guys who are trying to reach that mainstream success, they're looking at Drake as the blueprint. For the last 11 years, there has not been a single year where Drake has not dropped some sort of project. Ironically, except for 2026, unless he drops Iceman like before I actually release this video. But isn't that crazy, you guys? He's dropped an album every single year for 11 years. And sometimes, some years, you even get more than one album. How are you supposed to compete in an environment where the highest performers from a numbers and sales perspective are putting out that much quantity, right? Longevity makes a classic album, but how are you supposed to prioritize longevity when the labels don't want to invest in you unless you follow that NBA Youngboy or that Drake type of blueprint, which is conducive, I think is the right word, or not conducive to creating a classic album. There's other factors, right? I mean, I think this whole generation, especially after COVID, we spend way too much time inside on social media. Our lives are on the internet, right? A lot of these artists who, gave us some of the most memorable classic albums, they were telling stories that 90% of this generation won't ever experience, right? And with our lives being so much more sheltered, introverted, just less eventful, there's not as much to talk about. So you see a lot of subject matter in music dying down. And that's not just because, it's easier to consume in those 15-second TikTok interval sound bites, but it's also because maybe we're just living more boring lives today than we were back in the day. I don't know. Maybe that's a more pessimistic outlook on this whole thing. And no, this is not me saying that there are no classic albums that have come out in the last few years, right? It goes back to the timelessness factor and the longevity factor. I think a lot of projects from the last couple of years will age to be modern day classics, especially the projects that followed the factor of having that cohesive vision, which is one of the more important factors that we touch on in this video. When you look at a lot of the best albums that we've gotten over the last damn near decade, the dynamic of those projects is usually set up where it's one artist teaming up with one producer for a cohesive sound and vision. Think about Nas and Hit Boy. Think about Alchemist and Freddie Gibbs, or Madlib and Freddie Gibbs. Think about Pharrell with the Clips. You could even make the argument for Kendrick with Mustard and Soundwave on GNX, right? Or even, in the subgenres like trap music, you got all these Metro Boomin albums. Those are some of the best albums, in my opinion, of the 2020s decade. Heroes and Villains, incredible project. That album features the likes of Future, Travis, Young Thug, 21 Savage, Gunna, Don Toliver, and a lot more. And in my opinion, that project itself, because probably it was orchestrated by one producer who had a cohesive vision for the entire project, it's better than any of the solo albums that we got from any of the artists that were actually featured on the project in the last few years, right? Like Heroes and Villains, that album itself is better than any Young Thug, Gunna, 21 Savage project that we've gotten since 2018? It goes back to the fact that Metro had that cohesive vision factor in mind when he was creating that project. And remember, you guys, this whole thing is just my opinion, right? But I do think that a classic album can be narrowed down to those 8 different factors that we discussed here today. And hopefully in the future, we see a lot more artists not try to bend a knee to the algorithm, not compromise, but instead break the cycle, follow the blueprint of what makes a classic album, and take music to a whole other level in the future. But let me know what you guys think, and I'll catch you in the next one.
I study rapaholics for a living.